Before we begin tonight's terrifying true story, I want you to think about the last time you drove alone on a long highway at night. That feeling of being completely isolated, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but darkness stretching endlessly in your rearview mirror. Tonight's story comes from Marcus, a software engineer who thought a solo road trip from Denver to San Francisco would be a peaceful way to clear his head after a difficult breakup. What started as a simple drive across Interstate 80 became a nightmare of pursuit and terror that lasted over 400 miles through the most isolated parts of Wyoming. As I tell you Marcus's story, remember that this really happened, and it could happen to anyone who finds themselves alone on America's endless highways after dark. My name is Marcus, and I used to love driving cross-country alone. There's something peaceful about the rhythm of highway travel, the way miles of open road can clear your mind and put your problems in perspective. Interstate 80 from Denver to San Francisco was a route I'd driven several times before, usually during the day, but this time I was making the trip at night to avoid traffic through the cities. I'd left Denver around 8 p.m. on a Friday in November, planning to drive straight through and arrive in San Francisco by late Saturday afternoon. The weather was clear, my car was running perfectly, and I had a full tank of gas and a playlist of podcasts to keep me company through the long Wyoming stretch that lay ahead. The first few hours went exactly as planned. I made good time through Colorado, stopped for coffee and gas in Sterling, and crossed into Nebraska as the sun disappeared completely behind me. The interstate was busy enough that I never felt isolated, with a steady stream of truckers and other travelers heading west toward whatever awaited them in California. By the time I reached Cheyenne, Wyoming around midnight, I was feeling confident about the drive and looking forward to the empty stretches ahead, where I could make up time and enjoy the solitude of the high plains. It was just past Cheyenne, maybe 20 miles west on I-80, when I first noticed the black SUV in my rearview mirror. At first, there was nothing unusual about it, just another vehicle heading west, probably someone making the same long haul I was. But as the miles passed and the other traffic thinned out, I began to realize that this SUV was maintaining exactly the same speed I was, staying roughly a quarter mile behind me no matter how my speed fluctuated. When I sped up to pass a slow-moving truck, the SUV sped up too. When I settled back to cruise control at 75, it settled back as well, maintaining that precise distance like it was tethered to my car by an invisible rope. For the first hour, I told myself it was just coincidence. Interstate 80 across Wyoming is basically a straight line for 400 miles, and it's natural that vehicles would maintain similar speeds and spacing on such a monotonous stretch of highway. But as we passed Green River and headed into the emptiest part of the state, with no other traffic visible in either direction, that SUV remained exactly where it had been for the past 100 miles. The consistency was unnatural, deliberate, and I began to feel the first cold fingers of unease creeping up my spine. I decided to test my growing suspicion by varying my speed more dramatically. I slowed down to 65, then 60, watching my rearview mirror to see what the SUV would do. It slowed down too, maintaining that same quarter-mile gap. Then I accelerated to 85, hoping to either lose it or force it to reveal its intentions by struggling to keep up. Instead, it accelerated smoothly, effortlessly matching my speed and maintaining that maddening precise distance. This wasn't coincidence or similar travel plans. Someone in that black SUV was deliberately following me across the Wyoming desert, and I had no idea why. The realization that I was being stalked hit me like a physical blow, making my hands shake on the steering wheel, and my heart rate spike dangerously. I was alone on one of the most isolated stretches of highway in America, with the nearest town at least 50 miles in any direction, and someone with unknown intentions was tracking my every move. My first instinct was to call the police, but when I checked my phone, I had only one bar of signal and wasn't even sure what jurisdiction I was in. Wyoming State Patrol. Maybe, but I didn't know their number, and 911 seemed premature for what was technically just someone driving behind me on a public highway. I tried to get a better look at the SUV, but its headlights were too bright and too distant to make out any details about the vehicle or its driver. It appeared to be a large, dark SUV, possibly black or dark blue, but beyond that, I couldn't determine the make, model, or even whether there was one person or multiple people inside. The anonymity made it even more frightening. This wasn't road rage or a case of mistaken identity, but something calculated and patient that had been going on for over 100 miles without any obvious provocation or explanation. As we approached Rock Springs, I decided to exit and see what the SUV would do. If it was really following me, it would have to exit too, and if it was just traveling the same route by coincidence, it would continue west on the interstate. I took the Rock Springs exit and drove toward the first gas station I could find, a 24-hour truck stop that looked busy enough to provide some safety in numbers. My hands were sweating as I pulled up to a pump and turned off my engine, immediately scanning the entrance to see if the black SUV would appear. It did. Less than 30 seconds after I'd stopped, the SUV pulled into the truck stop parking lot and positioned itself near the far edge, where the driver would have a clear view of my car but would be partially hidden in the shadows. Between the overhead lights, the engine stayed running, the headlights stayed on, and no one got out. For 20 minutes, while I filled my tank and bought coffee inside the convenience store, that SUV sat there like a predator watching its prey. The cashier noticed my nervousness and asked if everything was okay, but what could I tell him? That someone was parked in his lot looking at me. When I finally worked up the courage to walk back to my car, I could see a silhouette behind the SUV's windshield. Definitely a person, apparently alone, just sitting there watching me. As soon as I started my engine and pulled back onto the interstate, the SUV followed, resuming its position exactly a quarter mile behind me, as if nothing had happened. The message was clear. This wasn't random, and it wasn't going to stop. Someone was committed to following me across Wyoming, and I was trapped on an endless highway with nowhere to hide and no one to help. I called 911 from the highway, finally, getting through to a dispatcher who connected me to Wyoming State Patrol. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, describing the black SUV that had been following me for over 150 miles and the fact that it had followed me off the interstate and waited while I stopped for gas. The trooper I spoke with was professional but not particularly helpful. "Is the vehicle threatening you directly?" he asked, "trying to run you off the road or making aggressive moves?" When I admitted that the SUV was just following at a safe distance, he explained that there wasn't much they could do unless the driver committed an actual traffic violation or made some kind of threatening gesture. "Look, son," the trooper said, and I could hear the sympathy in his voice, "I believe you that something doesn't feel right, but following someone on a public highway isn't technically a crime. If this vehicle tries to force you off the road or makes any aggressive moves, call us immediately and we'll have units. Respond. Until then, stay on the main highway, keep your doors locked, and don't stop in any isolated areas. Can you make it to Laramie without stopping again?" Laramie was still 200 miles away, but I told him I thought I could make it. What choice did I have? I couldn't stop, couldn't deviate from the route, couldn't do anything but maintain course and hope that whatever this person wanted, they would lose interest before we reached a place where I could find real help. The trooper promised to alert other units along I-80 to watch for a black SUV following a white Honda Civic, but with the vast distances and limited patrol coverage in Wyoming, I knew I was essentially on my own until I reached a larger town. The next 100 miles were a nightmare of tension and paranoia. Every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, that SUV was there, maintaining its precise distance like a satellite locked in orbit. My hands cramped from gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my neck ached from constantly checking my mirrors, and my gas gauge became an object of obsession as I calculated and recalculated whether I could make it to Laramie without stopping. The Wyoming landscape, which had always seemed peaceful and majestic during previous trips, now felt hostile and threatening. The vast emptiness that I'd once found beautiful now represented how far I was from any possible help. Around 4 a.m., somewhere between Rawlins and Laramie, the SUV's behavior changed. Instead of maintaining its steady distance, it began to accelerate, closing the gap between us with deliberate intent. Within minutes, it had moved from a quarter mile behind to maybe 200 yards, then 100 yards, its headlights growing larger and brighter in my mirrors. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized that whatever patience or restraint had been governing this person's behavior for the past 300 miles was coming to an end. The pursuit was entering a new, more dangerous phase. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my Civic up to 90 mph on the dark highway. The SUV accelerated too, easily keeping pace and continuing to close the distance. At 95 mph, with my engine straining and my hands shaking on the wheel, the SUV pulled into the left lane and began to pull alongside me. For the first time in 6 hours, I was going to see who had been following me across the Wyoming desert, and every instinct I had was screaming that I didn't want to know. The SUV's windows were tinted too dark to see inside, even with my headlights reflecting off the glass. It paced me for maybe 30 seconds, matching my speed exactly while positioned just slightly behind my driver's side door. Then, without warning, it swerved sharply toward me, trying to force me off the highway onto the narrow shoulder. I yanked my steering wheel to the right, feeling my tires hit the rumble strips as I fought to maintain control. The SUV straightened out and fell back, then immediately tried the same maneuver. Again, this time from slightly ahead of me, cutting across my lane in an obvious attempt to make me lose control. For the next 20 miles, this deadly game of cat and mouse continued. The SUV would pull alongside me, try to force me off the road, then fall back and try a different approach. Sometimes it would tailgate me so closely that I couldn't see its headlights in my mirror, just a wall of black metal filling my rear window. Other times it would speed ahead and then slow down abruptly, trying to make me rear-end it. Each attack was calculated, patient, methodical, not the reckless aggression of road rage, but something far more frightening, the deliberate actions of someone who had planned this confrontation and was now executing it with practiced skill. My phone had no signal in this stretch of highway, my gas gauge was approaching a quarter tank, and my engine was starting to overheat from the sustained high speeds. I was trapped in a high-speed pursuit with someone who clearly knew these roads better than I did, and had some kind of plan that I was too terrified to imagine. Just when I thought I might have to choose between running out of gas or being forced off the road, I saw the distant glow of lights ahead, a small town that represented the first sanctuary I'd seen in hundreds of miles. The town was barely more than a truck stop and a few buildings clustered around a highway exit, but it had working streetlights and what looked like a 24-hour diner. I took the exit at dangerous speed, hoping to reach the safety of witnesses and light before the SUV could make another attempt to run me off the road. But as I pulled into the parking lot of the diner, my relief turned to horror. The black SUV didn't follow me down the exit ramp. Instead, it continued west on the interstate, disappearing into the darkness like it had never existed at all. At first, I thought I'd finally escaped, that the presence of the town had spooked my pursuer into giving up the chase. I sat in the diner parking lot with my engine running, hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened and figure out my next move. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was another exit from this small town, a back road that reconnected with I-80 about 10 miles west, and sitting at that intersection, barely visible in the distance, was the silhouette of a large, dark vehicle. The SUV hadn't given up or been scared off by the town. It had simply taken a shortcut, using local roads that I didn't know existed to position itself ahead of me on the route to Laramie. Whoever was driving that vehicle knew these Wyoming back roads intimately, had probably traveled this stretch of highway many times before, and was now demonstrating that they could anticipate my moves and cut off my escape routes. I wasn't just being followed anymore, I was being herded, guided towards some destination or confrontation that this person had chosen in advance. I stayed in that diner parking lot for 2 hours, drinking coffee and trying to figure out what to do next. The local police number went to an answering service that promised someone would call me back within an hour. The Wyoming State Patrol dispatcher took my updated report, but explained that without a license plate number or a clear description of the driver, there wasn't much they could do except patrol the area. The SUV remained visible in the distance, a dark shape against the horizon that never moved, never left, just waited with inhuman patience for me to make my next move. As the sun began to rise over the Wyoming plains, I realized I had only two choices. I could stay in this small town indefinitely, hoping that daylight and the possibility of increased police patrols would convince my stalker to give up, or I could continue toward Laramie and hope that I could outrun or outsmart someone who had already demonstrated superior knowledge of the terrain and apparently unlimited patience. Neither option felt safe, but staying put felt like accepting defeat, acknowledging that one person with unknown motives could trap me indefinitely in a town I'd never heard of. I decided to make a run for Laramie, but with a different strategy. Instead of taking I-80 directly, I would use back roads and alternate routes, trying to avoid the predictable path that my pursuer seemed to know so well. I had a detailed atlas in my car and enough gas to make several detours if necessary. If I could reach Laramie by an unexpected route, I might be able to contact police there and arrange some kind of escort or protection for the remainder of my journey, but as I pulled out of the diner parking lot and headed for what I thought was a back road to Laramie, I discovered just how thoroughly I'd underestimated my situation. The black SUV appeared in my rearview mirror within 5 minutes, having somehow anticipated my route choice or simply followed me from a distance I couldn't detect. Over the next 3 hours, no matter which road I took, which direction I turned, or how many times I doubled back or changed course, that SUV remained behind me like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. It became clear that I wasn't dealing with a random stalker or even someone who had targeted me specifically. This person knew the entire network of roads in this part of Wyoming better than I knew the streets of my own neighborhood. They could predict my moves, cut off my escape routes, and appear on any road I chose like they had access to real-time tracking of my location. The more I tried to evade them, the more trapped I felt, like a mouse in a maze being observed by scientists who knew every possible path. I finally reached Laramie around noon on Saturday, exhausted and terrified after nearly 16 hours of pursuit across 400 miles of Wyoming highways. The black SUV followed me all the way to the police station, then drove slowly past as I stumbled through the front doors and collapsed into a chair in the lobby. When the officers came outside to look for it, the SUV was gone, disappeared as suddenly and completely as it had appeared the night before outside Cheyenne. The Laramie police took my report seriously and reviewed what little evidence I had, some blurry photos I'd managed to take with my phone, the timeline of the pursuit, and the detailed description of the vehicle's behavior over hundreds of miles. But without a license plate, a clear view of the driver, or any obvious crime beyond following someone on public roads, there wasn't much they could do except file a report and advise me to contact them if it happened again. I never continued to San Francisco. Instead, I flew home from Laramie and had my car shipped back to Denver, too shaken to attempt any more long-distance driving. The police investigation never identified my pursuer or explained why someone would spend an entire night stalking a stranger across Wyoming's empty highways. The case was eventually closed as harassment by unknown subject, just another unsolved incident in the vast spaces where anything can happen and no one will ever know. I still think about that night every time I see Interstate 80 on a map or hear someone talking about driving cross-country alone. Somewhere out there, someone with detailed knowledge of Wyoming's back roads and an apparently unlimited capacity for patient stalking is probably still traveling those highways, looking for the next solo driver to follow through the darkness. The thing that terrifies me most isn't what happened, but what was supposed to happen. Was the plan to force me off the road in a location where my body might never be found? To follow me all the way to California for some confrontation I can't imagine? Or was the psychological torture of the pursuit itself the entire point? If you ever find yourself driving alone on isolated highways, especially at night, pay attention to the vehicles around you and trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Don't assume that someone following you will eventually lose interest or turn off at the next exit. Some predators have infinite patience and detailed knowledge of terrain that you'll never possess. And remember that in places like Wyoming you can drive for hours without seeing another soul, which means if someone decides to hunt you on those empty roads, you're going to be entirely on your own until you can reach safety. Stay alert out there, keep your gas tank full, and never underestimate how vulnerable you are when you're alone on America's endless highways, because sometimes the most dangerous thing on the road isn't an accident or mechanical failure. It's another human being who has decided that you're exactly what they've been looking for.